From my kitchen studio in San Francisco, and welcome to BRC and Friends, a regular-ish 30-minute Google Hangout with me, Bruce Reyes-Chow, where I chat with friends and adventurers from around the interwebs. Not only do we talk about my guest-specific projects and passions, but we get a little more insight into who each is as a complex and beautifully made human being. Today, I welcome to the show Drew Hart, so we'll put Drew on the screen there. Say, hey, Drew,
Hey, how you
thanks for being
doing?
here.
Yep, thank you for
Drew is a PhD candidate in theology. He's a part-time professor, writer, and activist with 10 years of pastoral experience. He speaks regularly in churches, colleges, and conferences. And his first book, Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism. This is the book right here. It helps to make antiracism theory and theology accessible in the hopes of transforming our witness in society. He has his blog, which is really good and popular, Taking Jesus Seriously, and it's hosted on the Christian Century. He and his family live in Philadelphia, and you can follow him on Twitter at DRU, not DRUE, DRUHART, on Facebook, and of course you can order his book on Amazon. I'll have all the links for you. But before we jump in, please take a moment to check out all the links. They're going to be down below in the box there. Share this video as you're watching it. Leave comments. Tweet along with us. Be Reyes-Chow and Drew Hart, and use the hashtag BRC and Friends. As usual, our time is broken into a few segments. The first we're going to set around Drew and his book and all the great things about that he's doing. The second, we're going to talk about a current event. We always try to talk about something that's beyond and outside of what we do publicly. And then the last time, I always ask a few just random questions that nobody knows with what's coming. So that's always a great part of the show. So we're going to get started, though. So Drew, if you could just tell us, there's the bio that people read and all that, but tell us a little bit about yourself. You know, give us the brief, quick. Who is Drew Hart?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's kind of a deep question for me right now because I'm trying to figure that out. I think every day I wake up, I'm like, who is Drew Hart? And I think some of the reason why is I've been in a lot of transition. So after graduating college, I went to Messiah, but after that, I've been a pastor for 10 years. And recently, this summer, I stepped down from pastoring. And so I'm trying to figure out, for the first time as an adult, what it means to not be a pastor officially, at least in that role, but still have a lot of pastoral sensibilities, and trying to figure out, you know, as I'm transitioning towards academia, you know, what does this mean and who am I and what's my role in all of this? So that's some of it. But I guess so, and I think sometimes people don't realize how significant like that has been for a lot of my life, because people are seeing me more now as, you know, a public intellectual or something, but that's a big part of me, my life. And I was worked at an inner city after school program for several years in Harrisburg. That's deeply shaped me as well. Let's see, I'm a PA, all PA boy. All my schooling has been in Pennsylvania, whether it be elementary, middle school, high school, but also college, seminary, and now my doctoral program. Different places, but it's all been PA. So in some ways, I'm very local and very focused in this area. I think what's interesting about me, well, I should say I am married and I have 2 kids. And so that's a big part of my life. I historically have loved playing basketball most of my life, although for the past few years, I have not been playing basketball at all. I make it out maybe once or twice a year, and I usually hurt myself. It's not usually, I get out there and they're running around, and I used to be the guy that was fast and that nobody wanted to guard because I just ran too hard. And now I maybe can make it into a second game before I'm on the side huffing and puffing and about to have a breakdown.
So how old are you, Drew?
I'm 33.
Okay.
Yeah, it shouldn't be that bad, but I allowed my dissertation program, my PhD program, to redirect my life too much, and now I'm out of shape, and it's getting pretty ugly. And I guess the one hobby, I have a new hobby. This past year, I've been fish keeping. I have a 20-gallon aquarium. I've been playing around, mixing different fish and kind of, getting into it a little bit. So I enjoy that.
It's amazing how cathartic watching an aquarium can be.
Yeah,
It
it
really is.
is.
And we've had aquariums throughout our life and our family and everything. We've always found that nobody really wants to clean it after a while.
Right,
That's our
right.
biggest. Like, they're pretty, but nobody wants to really get in there. But that's great. Well, and I hear you. I pastored a church for almost 14 years. I was the founding pastor, and I remember when I left to kind of shift into more public, whatever it's called. That's a huge transition. When at the heart, like we're pastors, and so.
Right,
But that's not our only, like, we don't want to be defined by being the pastor, and
right,
so I'm feeling, yeah, and like that whole transition was liberating and
right.
murky at all at the same time.
Yeah,
So
all at the
thank you.
same time.
That's helpful for sharing. Okay, so let's talk about your book. So again, I'm going to show the cover there. Why did you decide, like, so you wrote this before you're done with your PhD?
Yes.
Right. So I'm not to bag on my PhD friends. I'm thankful that you wrote it before your PhD, because it would be interesting to see what it's like after,
Yeah.
because it would be a different feel and all that kind of stuff. But what got what said I'm going to write this, and then what actually made you do it? I mean, I talk to people all the time. I have a book in my head. Well, that's great. It's not really a book until you write it. So what sparked you to kind of think about doing it, and then what actually got you to sit down and write?
Yeah. Well, I should say first, I had no intention of writing this book at all. I was at the time that I was working on my coursework for my doctoral program and just finishing up, thinking about comprehensive exams and all of those issues. And I went to a conference in September, I guess that'd be 2014. I was doing some workshops there. And one of the people there was Amy Gingrich, who is the top person of Herald Press.
Mm-hmm.
And she came to me and she's like, Drew, how would you like to write a book on race in the church? She's like, we need a book on race in the church right now, and you're the person to do it. And I'm thinking like, well, you do know I'm busy. I've got academic goals. This is
Right.
timely, I agree, but everyone is telling me don't do this kind of stuff before you've done your program. Get your program done and then do it.
Right.
But for whatever reason, as I was sitting and talking and explaining all the reasons why I shouldn't, I agreed that I would anyway. And that's because it was heavy on my heart. This was right after Michael Brown had been executed on the streets. This is during the unrest, and I was watching as the church was once again just fumbling through how to respond to these issues, miscommunicating, not dialoguing well on these issues. And so I knew that there needed to be an intervention in the church, that we needed both theological framework to think about it a little bit differently, but also we just didn't understand race and racism very well. And so that was really what I wanted to do, was to kind of intervene and help provide a resource that could help the church think about race differently than it has, so that hopefully we could start a new trajectory. Yeah.
Great. Let me ask you, when you say the church, right?
Yeah.
I think,
Yeah.
as when you read this, you're really good at setting your context, and I think when most readers are going to, translate for where they are and all that. But when you, especially as you're probably getting read now by folks across the board, from kind of, for lack of a better word, mainline progressives to, evangelicals to white church, black church, all that. When you say the church, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, so it's complicated. I mean it generally to say the church as a whole, although I do think different segments have different issues that need to be dealt with.
Right.
But I do think, so in this case, I would say that the whole church could do better at thinking about race, but for different reasons. But so on one hand, in some ways, I probably sometimes mean the dominant expression of church, but other times I also mean the whole entire church. So I think the white church in particular obviously has historically has missed it. They've been off the mark over and over and over again throughout our history in America, and I think that is pretty obvious. But I do think that even beyond that, even in the Black church, I mean, I think sometimes we have this idea of the Black church that doesn't really exist. And so we can sometimes, especially in academia, the Black church is so amazing and all that stuff. I'm like, yo, look, tell that to Martin Luther King, who was trying to get some help. And it was a very small percentage. We like to forget that actually had the courage to back him. And so I think that, you know, much more broadly than we would like to imagine throughout the church, we struggle. Maybe for different reasons, not always to the same degree, but I think all of us could use an intervention in various ways.
Right. Thank you. That's helpful. So, you know, I was able to read it, and I think all of us who got pre-copies got them all on the same day, because I saw, you know, online people like, oh, look, I got my copy. So we must have all like, oh, what's this? And then I got it. So your PR team and your marketing team has done a great job. So let me ask you a little bit. So I think one of the difficulties has been, and I'm going to focus kind of on really well-intentioned folks who know they have problems and issues and are trying to figure that out. I mean, that's kind of my sweet spot. I mean, and it's not to give people to let them off the hook or anything, but it's just kind of, these are folks who are really struggling with stuff. So I think there's this constant battle between heart and head, and you get to that a little bit in chapter 4 around not going with your gut and the socialization of people. Talk a little bit about that, because I think folks, when they see things going on, and I'll give you a good example. So recently, InterVarsity released a statement about Black Lives Matter. I don't know if you've seen it or not.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, a little bit, yeah.
So at the beginning says, while we don't agree with everything that Black Lives Matter stands for, like, and then lists off, like, calling for violence and da-da-da-da, we were like, why did you have to put that in, right?
Because that's not what they're about, right?
Exactly. It was just like, that's not right. And then they tied it to pro-life stuff. It was just a really interesting statement. I'll link to it at the bottom of the podcast. But I think there is, I think, this tension between heart and what people see and feel and just know. And I think we tend to just kind of go with our first reactions. But you're challenging us on that a little bit. So talk a little bit about that and why we need to think a little bit differently about how we react.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the challenges is that people think about race and racism and they think it's common sense. Everyone thinks they're an expert on race. Everyone thinks that they understand what's going on. No one believes that they need to be taught. No one believes that they need to study. We don't think we need any historical background. We don't need to understand the social patterns going on. We just go with our gut. It's common sense. And if you live in a community where everybody around you has this common sense, this dominant cultural perspective of what, you know, race and racism is, then it's easy. You don't have to ask any questions. Your worldview is just being reaffirmed over and over again. So if you see a Black person and you're afraid of him, and your society's giving you all these kind of reasons that you've been socialized into, again, it's common sense. You don't question it. And so what I wanted to do in that chapter was to help people think through socialization and how that shapes us. Sometimes we can focus so much on white and Black that we miss that some of these epistemological, our ways of knowing and seeing, right, how we see others, a lot of that is shaped by our being socialized in different communities and cultures, and in being in different discourses with different people groups. So what I did was, and I think I wrote it a little angry, I think. This is like, I'm coming from the back door. I'm not gonna approach this subject like everybody wants me to. That's kind of like what I was thinking. So I was like, we're gonna walk through history. You know, 1650, right? Or whatever, I forget my dates but like in the 1600s, you know, most white people, nobody will argue, got it wrong when it comes to race. They're racialized, racial codes are coming into place. And so there's no question, 1700s, 1800s, no question. Everybody can look, see repeatedly, over and over again, century after century, white people were getting it wrong. They were dehumanizing Black people. They were enslaving them. They were doing all kinds of things. They're wiping out Native Americans. No one questions now. They're like, oh yeah, white people, we got it wrong. That's terrible, horrifying. 1950, right? Still, even in the mid-20th century, you got KKK, you got lynching, you got Jim Crow laws, you got all kinds of stuff going on throughout the 20th century. Everybody can even still look back and say, yeah, the majority of white people were getting it wrong, that their social intuitions were leading them to see things in a way that were distorted. And at the same time, people of color, Black people, brown people, Asian people, at various points throughout American history have been able to offer a counter vision. At the exact same time, they were able to see something different. And I don't believe it's because we have different brains. I don't think it's because we're all human beings, right? We all are experiencing the world as human beings. So then what is the difference? And I think it's gotta be socialization. So when we get up to the present day, and we're in the same place where white people insist that Black people don't know what they're talking about, that white people think that they have an advantage in understanding these racial issues, I want to suggest maybe if we take seriously the fact that we have 350 years where everyone can agree that the majority of white people were getting it wrong, and that for 350 years, everyone can agree that people of color were getting it right, then what is the chance that suddenly, randomly, inexplicably, for no reason, everybody switched places, right? So that now white people suddenly, in our generation, are the ones who can see clearly, and people of color who've been getting it right suddenly cannot see clearly anymore. And I think it sounds ludicrous when we think about it in that way. And so I think once we take seriously socialization and how that shapes us, maybe hopefully it can allow us to be a little more humble and to be a little more receptive to hearing the views of others and allowing other people's perspectives to also shape our own.
Right. Good stuff, man. Great. You know, and I hear people like, but Obama got elected, but this happened, but this happened. So, oh, there's my college student looking in the. Hi, Evelyn. Sorry, I'm doing a podcast, son. Hi. So I'm going to keep going. So you know, I think people like look at all these things, and you know, you hear it all the time, right? It's not as bad as it used to be. Almost
Right.
like be grateful for what you got now. I mean, it could be so much worse. So why? I mean, and again, I think if folks just kind of step back and try to think about it, like just like you said, I think the way you lay it out is brilliant. So appreciate that. That's gonna keep going. Let me keep moving on here. So you mentioned on page, I think 126 or so, you start talking about economics. And this kind of bit, not just about Black folks, but poor Black folks, and what is how that plays. And I've heard stories from folks who are more involved with, differently involved in parts of the Black Lives Matter movements and other things, that there's also some divide about intellectualism and all this stuff around who's at fault, who's in charge, all those kind of things. But talk a little bit about socioeconomics and how that plays out in the midst of the conversations around race, around Black folks in the United States, around Black Lives Matter, because I think that's a huge piece. And some people, I think, want to just say, it's all socioeconomics. But you're not saying that. And so how does socioeconomics play into all this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to be able to talk about race and class. And I think, and again, so when you're talking about the Black church, I think this is a shortcoming, is not staying attentive enough to race and class and its intersections. And part of this, and I'll put it out there, is the Black church has, over the years, decade after decade, has kept moving further and further away from the life of poor Black folk. I mean, this has been documented all the way back from Lincoln and Mamiya's classic work on the Black church. They did a sociological study and they documented this. This was in the late 90s. And so I think that having more conversations around race and class, and so many of the churches, ironically, that are some of the greatest forces for justice are also extremely middle class and they're not a part of the poor Black community. And so there's this strange irony there. And so I think there is a lot of leadership, and I'm a part of this, right? I'm a part of this academic, middle class. Many of us have moved out of that, world, maybe not necessarily physically. So I live in a poor Black community. but certainly my own livelihood and inertia
Right.
is Black middle class, you
Right.
know? And so how do we keep that in the forefront? And how are we making space for leadership for everybody? And my goal is not to exclude anybody in that, but I do think that we need to prioritize the most vulnerable in our societies, and allow their voices and their gifts and their leadership to come to rise. And I think that there's a conflict then, because it doesn't always look the way we want it to. And I think issues around respectability, which is some of the debates that are going on right now in the Black community, especially among young Black folk, are part of it. Is, you know, what is the appropriate Black person to the appropriate Black activist or spokesperson, right? Do we all have to look like Cornel West and be docked out to the finest? And that's fine. I think that's fine. And I love and I appreciate looking at, you know, the 1960s and seeing all the folks in their kind of plain Black suits and a tie. It's very simple and it looks great and wonderful. But, you know, folks from around the way, not everybody can just pop on a suit and play that game, right? Can they be authentically themselves and also contribute to this work? And are we all willing to make space for all the different gifts and voices? And I think that if we're honest, while I absolutely believe that everybody, whether you're poor and Black or you're rich and Black, and the same thing goes for all people of color, you're going to be facing racism. But when these intersect and overlap, that's where things get really hard and difficult, and where you really got to jump through many more obstacles. And so I think that we've got to really be attentive to folks who are living at these various intersections, and I think they're the most vulnerable, and we need to, I think we know where Jesus would be, right? Standing in solidarity with the most vulnerable, and we need to do the same.
Yep. No, thank you. I think there is that. We do know where Jesus would be. That's great. It's like, but I'm not gonna go there. I mean, yeah, no, I hear it. So something came to mind as you were talking about the images from the '60s of leaders and now, and I think about my own community and the Filipino farm workers when they were working on their labor strikes and all those. Like my grandfather and his compadres and the Manongs of that time, they were dressed to the nines. I mean, they look good. And you look at the leaders today, and it's like the same thing. Like, you know, snapbacks, and you know, I'm like, how are you dressing going to these political meetings? And you could just see this tension between, like, yeah, we wanted that next generation, but we didn't want them to look like that. Like, it wasn't whatever that is. That's not what we were thinking. But so kind of going around that, I was. As an Asian American who's passionate about these things and loves talking about this stuff, I was as I was reading it, I was like, okay, so where are the brown folks in this? Like, where are the brown folks coming? Because it's always, and it's not that. I say we don't want to set up this competition. We don't want to, but in California, it's not just a black and white. It's not as that easy because it's so diverse here in different ways. And I know in some parts of the country, that's the dominant narrative historically and everything. And so I'm glad you addressed it. And so you get to a section beyond black and white. So let me ask you, how do we avoid kind of setting up this competition? Because I certainly don't want to start ranking who's more oppressed, who's had more history, all those kind of things. And I do acknowledge that for Asian Americans, we have a different set of privilege and exclusion. But how would you advise the larger community of color to not engage in kind of this ranking, or to feel like there's some zero-sum game to justice and things? So speak to us for a little bit about that, especially around your section beyond black.
Yeah. So I'll use an example from one of my classes. So I teach for a biblical seminary for the urban program, and I was teaching a brilliant cohort. Everyone Black. Everyone in the cohort is Black, and I'm teaching a course called Ethnicity, Gender, and Theology. And so one of the books that we read was about immigration, and so it was almost completely focused on, you know, Hispanics and Latinos in America. And some of the students were very frustrated with the book. They're like, well, why are they not talking about black people? How can we talk, you know? And so again, and I was like, look, guys, I'm like, look, like, there's no question, like, we've gone through 400 years of racial oppression. There's no one's denying that, right? But like, we're not the only ones that live within white supremacy, within a white supremacist world. There is a white supremacist world that structures, and a whole bunch of different people groups are navigating this, and it's impacted them in different ways. And some of your questions, because I think some of their questions were actually valid questions. I think I'm like, these are questions that you should sit down and have conversations with folks, right? Because I know in Philadelphia, for example, there's a lot of frustration around a lot of, in the Black community, a lot of stores are owned by Asian, owners. And so there's been like this history of tension between Black communities and these store owners. And so I'm like, well, I think these are questions that we need to be sitting down. So usually when we talk about reconciliation in the church, right, it's always about Black and whites, right? I'm like, these are the folks that you guys are engaging with all the time. They are also, though, I said, navigating a white supremacist world. And we've got to realize that. It looks different. It's not the same story. Come to learn and understand their story, you know. I tried to just position it like that to just help people understand that, you know, we're all navigating white supremacy. And the goal isn't to demonize people or to privilege ourselves. It's to subvert white supremacy and to, you know, engage with other people as human beings. And so I hope, you know, that they took that, you know, but I think it is challenging. I think, you know, we all want to privilege our story. And in some ways, it's inevitable, probably in some form or other, but I think that we also need to extend ourselves and learn to give, receive, and share stories and work together and collaborate and join in solidarity together, especially if we can work towards the same common goals of, again, destroying white supremacy and being more human as Christians who follow Jesus Christ. And it doesn't mean that there aren't challenges. It doesn't mean that there aren't other intercultural and ethnic conflicts that are going on that we need to work through. I think there are that much more that we need to have these conversations, share the stories, and even debate and argue and disagree at times, right? And I think that is much more fruitful, I think, in the long run.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think that the more we have those, the more we also stop buying into these kind of monolithic understandings of our own communities and as well as others, right? I mean, I think, you know, having conversations with Asian Americans about immigration, it depends on which Asian American group you're talking to, right? I mean, like, here's my immigration story, here's the Korean, I mean, it's just a fascinating thing. And so I think the challenge for us to actually have that, because I think there's this thing that if we, in some ways, if people of color admit that there's challenge within our own communities, in some ways we're like airing our dirty laundry, or we're saying we're not in like one unit. But I actually think it just makes us stronger when we're able to engage in that. But it is hard work. You know, I think, you know, it's one of those things. If community and justice were easy, we would do it. But it's not. So where do you find joy in this? For you, maybe, you know, the joy and the hope for you as an individual, and then where are you seeing that in kind of the movements around, if you want to be specific, around Black Lives Matter or larger scale, because there has to be something that's feeding you and others. I know there are for me, but where do you find that the joy and the hope in the midst of all of the struggle that's going on?
Yeah, I mean, well, so one of the things that I've been doing a lot is going into different church communities and engaging in dialogue and doing workshops and seminars. And I know some people out there was like, Drew, you must just be tired doing this, especially dealing with all those white people. That's what people say to me sometimes.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
I'm like, well, actually, not exactly. Like, it's actually because I've seen so many people kind of opening their eyes and kind of taking different postures and seeking solidarity. And I know that's not everybody, but there's a lot of folks out there who I think are ready. And I don't know, for me, that's exciting. Like, when I see people taking that turn and serious and digging in and leaning in, I think that that excites me, that motivates me, and that makes my work easy sometimes and very enjoyable. Um, so that's one thing, but also just seeing. So in Philadelphia, I mean, I'm part of a network, a group that we call Kingdom Builders. It's a network, urban leaders in the city, Christian leaders, and just seeing the collaboration, as well as just folks. I mean, there's a lot of churches where like everyone, oh yeah, justice is good, yeah, you just say that kind of. But seeing folks getting out there protesting, folks, just recently we had some folks. Now this was on immigration, and we had churches, Christian, some of my friends, blocking the path to the mayor's door, ready to get arrested if necessary, right? To try to stop this new law being passed in Philadelphia. I'm like, yeah, I like what I see going on. There's a movement here, and people who maybe a year or two ago were much more complacent are putting their own bodies on the line. And in some ways, for me, they're telling the Jesus story in their very own lives, right? People could actually watch them and say, yeah, I see Jesus being lived out in Philadelphia before my eyes, and I think that that's pretty cool and that's pretty inspiring.
Awesome, great. All right, let's jump to something else totally random. I like to talk with people about the things that beyond just the immediate project. So we both have kids.
Yes.
Mine are how old am I again? 12, 14, and 19. I pastored for almost 20 years before kind of shifting, and I'm actually going back into a church this year. So I'm going to ask you before I tell you how do you approach church going with your kids? And you can have it, you don't need to tell their names or anything if you don't want. But how old are they, and kind of what's been your perspective on pastors' kids and church?
Yeah, so well, my kids are on a different spectrum. So they're 4 and 2.
Oh, so they gotta go.
Yeah, they gotta go. But it's been interesting though, because so after stepping down from pastoral ministry, we also left that particular church and have been going to a church much closer to ours. But before we did, of course, we were kind of looking at a couple different churches around. I've got friends at different churches, so like, oh, let's check out their church and this, and certainly we're thinking about like, both what would be a good church. There's one thing to think like, oh, theologically, this church aligns with me perfectly, but it's nothing like, where is my family going to join into community and where they're all going to fit in and be discipled and be a part of a discipling community together. And so that's been something that I've been very conscious of and thinking about how do I engage my kids. So the church, so we're actually at, it's a church called Second Baptist of Germantown. Mostly Black church. They call themselves an integrated church, but it's in Germantown, which is a Black community, and a few white folks are sprinkled through, and other people of color as well. But it's mostly Black and a mostly Black tradition church. Right. But one of the things that I loved about going there, engaging, it was that they before they send the kids off, they had all the kids come, and they all the kids had like, you can a few pennies or coins and stuff. They put in the jar. The pastor always talks to them, engages them, prays for them. They've done some more extensive stuff as well, but they're always a part of the community. And I think that has been, and they're trying to teach, justice, even as a part of this community, connecting it. So the money that they give is going to other kids who don't have food, right? And so just trying to connect very small things for these kids as they're trying to integrate into the community and be a part of the community. So anyway, it's been good, I guess.
Yeah. Now, I wish there's so many things we could talk about, like our lives in somewhat parallel, maybe a few years out, but the church looking thing is really an interesting experience, especially when you've been in an area and you're not leaving. So when I left the church that I helped to start, it was clear that I would go somewhere else with our family, and you have friends who are the pastors of these churches, and you're you walk in, you're like, oh, yeah, well, I'm not going to be here, right? I mean, but this is your friend who you got to see at the next, clergy meeting, whatever. So we just basically made this kind of announcement that we will be church shopping. We will pop in for 2 or 3 Sundays at a time, but we're not. And we landed one place for a little bit and another for a little bit until we found the one place that we kind of all could agree on. And so I have teenagers. One of my kids loves church and kind of does it all the time and sang in the choir and did youth conferences and everything. My other two kids, they're not at the point of like, oh, I'm not going. They'll go, but they're not waking me up on Sunday morning going, come on, let's go to church. Like that's not where they are. And we're in this tender moment of, if you force something too much, right? Do they reel back, or do you let the flow happen and all that? Especially when I wasn't serving a congregation. So how are you gonna approach that? What do you think? Have you all talked about you will go to church until you're 16, and then you can? What have you all talked about?
Yeah, I mean, so we haven't fixed any rules like that. I mean, so I grew up, and I think some of it you kind of play with when you get to the point. But I mean, so I definitely grew up where it just wasn't an option, right? That was, maybe that's the old school, right?
Yeah.
But I do think we have to be careful. One of the things I am influenced by is the Anabaptist tradition. And historically, at least, one of the things that come with that is the idea of a voluntary community, right? And so it's not coerced.
Right.
So what does that mean, right? To not coerce your faith onto someone, but to share it as a gift. And I think that is something that I think parents need to work through. But at the same time, that's balanced with intentional. I mean, parenting in some ways ought to be seen as a form of discipleship, right, in and of itself. But that much more, it ought not to be coercive, right? So I don't know. So it goes back and forth.
that is like always, and it's like, it's interesting. I don't know if you discovered this yet too. Not having any responsibilities at the church.
Yes.
Makes it a very different, right? It's like, wow, I don't have to go to church today. I mean, it's like,
yes, I won't lie. I had a couple Sundays in a row where I just did not go, and I was like, the world didn't fall. The sky didn't, it was kind of weird, and so it's actually been interesting to like, I've got to actually want to go to church myself, not because I have to, but because I want to be there and I want to be a part of a community. And so it was just an interesting shift in my mind to actually think through that. I had to think about that. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. No, it's I'll be curious to see how this is going to look for you in the next few years. Is whatever you're going to be doing, and because I think it is really good for us as kind of pastors in the office to shift out of that. And we'll never have the typical kind of church person experience, but in many ways it's like, this kind of sucks, so I don't want to go to that. And when you were running it, you're like, why aren't people coming? I'm like, well, anyway, all right, so we're getting to the end of our time here, and I want to get to the random questions for you. So I'm just going to ask you 5 questions, and you can expand or not. You can just leave one word or whatever. It's up to you. So here we go. Your first question is: sound or smell that reminds you of your childhood?
Ooh, that is tough.
Don't think too hard.
So the first thing, and I can't even describe the smell, but all I can think of was, so I had family that lived up in New York, but like more upstate, like, what was that? Kingston, I guess, around that way. And I remember driving, and I don't know, when we hit, like, it's out in the middle of this mountains, there was this smell that would remind me of that area. But anyway, that's the only thing I got.
So was it like cow manure? It was like nature?
It wasn't. It was just this distinct, and I don't know if it was partly mental. I'm not sure how much there actually was a smell, but that area always had a smell to me that, I don't know, it's kind of weird. I can't describe.
It's like we take our kids out of San Francisco. It's like, that's the smell of not being in the city. There you go.
Right. Yeah, that's probably what it was. It's called air.
It's called air, yeah. All right, your next question is the first concert you ever attended.
First concert I ever attended. So our youth leaders took us to, I think it was called Carmen.
Oh man.
Yes, it was. And none of it, the funny thing is, none of us stayed in for, it was like this huge, I think it was like a Spectrum or something. I don't know what it was. None of us stayed in. We all went outside.
Carmen.
I don't know what that was. I don't even remember anything about it, really, other than that I was
still around. I mean, that was like, okay, I won't comment. But yes, okay, that was your first comment. Great. Your first or your worst job?
first job was I worked at a grocery store in the Philly area and push carts. You know, rain, snow, sleet, sun. I was out there pushing carts.
All right. I always teach one of the things we pass on our kids is always put the cart back, because there's a person that has to go and get it. So
that's right.
All right. If you can switch places for one day with any person in the world, you get all of their talent, their resources, and connections. Who would it be?
You
don't have to be deep. It can be, whatever.
So at least what came to mind immediately was Willie James Jennings. I just think maybe just because I just want to be him, right? I just think he's an amazing person. So if I could just like swap his life and
Yep.
Okay. Probably would flop, but
you get all the talent. That's the key thing. Is like you get
if I keep all his talent, then yes, absolutely. I think he's amazing.
All right, last question. So in baseball, when a player comes up to bat, they choose a song as their walk-up song. It plays behind their back end as they're going up. So you get a walk-up song kind of to every time you just enter a room or you. What's your song?
What's my song? Oh, wow. Now, this is probably not the song that I actually picked. The first song that comes to mind, I don't know why. Maybe it's because I'm a 90s kid. But I thought of Juicy from Biggie. I don't know where that came from. But is there anything else?
He's like, quick, let me think of another one.
There's got to be something else. I don't know. I'm not really sure what song I would want to be walking out to. That is actually an interesting question. I have no idea.
All right, last question. I'm going to ask you to pay it forward a little bit. If there's an organization or a person that you want more people to know about, like they're doing some good stuff and you just want to get a little more attention to them, who or what organization would that be?
Yeah. So I'm on a couple boards, but one of the nonprofits, this is a kind of a quirky response, but one of them is the Historic Mennonite, Historic Germantown Mennonite Trust. It's in Philadelphia, and I guess it's not because they're like changing the world or anything like that, but they hold the history of the first Mennonites that came to Philadelphia, to Germantown in 1683. But a part of that story is also in 1688 when some of these members wrote the very first anti-slavery petition ever. And so we have this table there that, at least according to tradition, is the very table that this petition was written on. So it's like kind of a symbol, right? And it was the document, I mean, they have a copy there. It's a very Christian document, making a Christian case for why people shouldn't be engaged in slavery. And so for me, in the midst of, the American story and so many Christians that could not see that, for me, that it's a symbol of, thinking about like, what is it about our Christian formation and our faith that helps us see faithfully and see justly and to act justly in response to it. So I would encourage people to actually come to Germantown. It's not a huge, come to this little Germantown, the historic building, check it out. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. And if you come there, there's other stuff in Philadelphia right around that way. You can go on a tour on the Underground Railroads and things like that. But I think that is important for us to think about, thinking about these symbols that remind us of faithful Christian lives and faithful ways of seeing the world. And I think that the Historic Germantown Trust is actually helping us do that. Yeah.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. I'll make sure that I include links. I'll just research and for so folks can check that out. All right. So we've reached the end of our time. So everyone, thanks for tuning into this episode of BRC and Friends. Thanks again to Drew Hart. This was great for hanging out today. Be sure to pick up his book, Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism. You can pick that up on Amazon.com. Be sure to check out the episode recap. I'll post that on Reyes-Chow.com, where I'll include, again, all the links and a little bit of breakdown of the show. Take a moment to subscribe to the channel here so you can make sure you don't miss any shows. Connect with us on all the links that are going to be down there. And lastly, if you want to help support the show, I'm now on Patreon, and you can go ahead and subscribe and help support what I'm doing here. And that's it for now. So again, Drew, thanks for hanging out today. I'm glad you could be with us. Folks, make sure you connect with Drew online. Until the next BRC and Friends, please keep talking because there are times when silence is not an option.